At some point, every Hollywood legend becomes a statue. The face freezes. The image becomes permanent. The audience remembers one version of the man and refuses to let him change. For Clint Eastwood, that version seemed simple. The silent cowboy. The man with the gun. The stranger who rode into town with a cigar in his mouth, a poncho over his shoulders, and danger in his eyes. Then came Dirty Harry. The cop who did not wait for permission. The man who looked at a broken system and answered with a weapon. For years, audiences saw Clint Eastwood as the fantasy of masculine certainty, a man who never hesitated, never apologized, and never needed to explain himself. But then, something strange happened. Eastwood got older. And instead of protecting the myth that made him famous, he began to question it. He returned to the Western and made Unforgiven, a film that stripped the glory out of killing. He returned to old age and made Gran Torino, where the tough man's final victory was not pulling the trigger. He returned to justice again and again, not to make it simple, but to show how dangerous certainty can be. That is the mystery of Clint Eastwood. He did not just survive Hollywood. He survived his own legend. And then, piece by piece, he began taking it apart. Clint Eastwood is not just a movie star. He is not just a director. He is one of the last remaining bridges to an older Hollywood, a Hollywood of westerns, war pictures, jazz, studio lots, practical filmmaking, weathered faces, and men who carried silence like a weapon. But his story is not only about survival. It is about transformation. The young Eastwood helped create the myth of the man who solves problems with violence. The old Eastwood spent decades asking whether that myth had poisoned the soul. And perhaps that is why his final chapter feels so haunting. Because Clint Eastwood lived long enough to become a witness against the very image that made him immortal. This is the life and final chapter of Clint Eastwood, Hollywood's most seasoned master. Clinton Eastwood Jr. was born on May 31, 1930, in San Francisco, California. He was not born into Hollywood royalty. There was no famous family name waiting for him. No studio contract arranged from childhood. No obvious path toward becoming one of the most recognizable figures in film history. His early years were shaped by movement, work, and the long shadow of the Great Depression. His family moved often. His father worked different jobs. His mother helped keep things steady. Like many boys of that era, Eastwood grew up in a world where men were expected to endure more than explain. Feelings were not discussed. Weakness was hidden. Work mattered. Silence was respected. That silence would later become one of his greatest tools. Before he became an icon, Eastwood was simply a tall, lean young man with a striking face and a quiet manner. He worked ordinary jobs. He served in the army. He loved music, especially jazz, and when he finally moved toward acting, success did not come quickly. Hollywood did not instantly recognize him as a future legend. He took small roles. He appeared where he could. He was another young actor trying to be noticed in a town full of young actors trying to be noticed. But Eastwood had something unusual. He understood stillness. Many actors try to fill the screen by doing more. Eastwood filled it by doing less. A pause. A stare. A slow movement. A line delivered without decoration. At first, that kind of acting can look empty. But if the camera believes the face, stillness becomes power. Television gave him his first major opening. In Rawhide, Eastwood became familiar to American audiences as Rowdy Yates. It was a Western, and that mattered. The Western was not just entertainment. It was America dreaming about itself. Open land. Hard choices. Lonely towns. Violence and order. Freedom and law. For decades, Westerns had given audiences heroes who were strong, clean, and morally certain. But the 1960s were changing everything. America was changing. Cinema was changing. The old heroes no longer seemed enough. And then a call came from Europe. Not from the center of Hollywood. Not from a major American studio. But from Italy. Director Sergio Leone was making a different kind of Western. It was rougher, stranger, more cynical, more stylish, and less noble than the Westerns American audiences had known. The role was not a classic hero. The budget was not enormous. The opportunity did not look, at first glance, like the beginning of immortality. But Clint Eastwood took it. And with that decision, one of the most important screen images of the 20th century was born. A fistful of dollars made Eastwood into something new. He did not play the traditional cowboy savior. He was not pure. He was not warm. He was not the shining defender of civilization. He was quiet, dangerous, self-interested, morally flexible, and impossible to read. He entered a corrupt town not like a hero, but like a storm. He watched. He calculated. He played enemies against each other. He survived because he understood violence and silence better than anyone around him. The poncho, the hat, the cigar, the squint, these became more than costume details. They became mythology. The strange thing about Eastwood's first great screen image is how little it gave away. He barely spoke. He rarely smiled. He seemed to arrive from nowhere and belong to no one. That silence became part of the myth. Audiences did not know who he was, what he wanted, or what he had done before entering the story. And because the character explained so little, viewers filled the empty space with their own imagination. That was the secret of the man with no name. He was not only a character, he was a question. What kind of man can walk through violence without appearing wounded by it? For decades, Eastwood would carry that question with him. And later, as a director, he would finally answer it. No man walks through violence untouched. The Dollars trilogy made Eastwood internationally famous. A fistful of dollars for a few dollars more. The good, the bad, and the ugly. Together, they helped reshape the Western. The Old West of clean morality gave way to a harsher landscape, where survival mattered more than speeches, and every man carried his own code. Eastwood's cowboy was not always good, but he was never weak. That difference mattered. He became a symbol for viewers who wanted a hero without softness, a man who could walk into chaos and leave with his own rules intact. But even inside those films, the later Eastwood was already hiding. The Western made him famous, but it also planted the great question of his life. What does violence do to a man? What does a hero become after the gunfire ends? Can justice survive when it is delivered by someone outside the law? Those questions would return again and again. They would return in Dirty Harry. They would return in Unforgiven. They would return in Gran Torino. They would return in Juror Number 2. Eastwood's career looked simple from a distance. A cowboy. A cop. A director. An old man. But up close, it is a long argument with himself. In the 1970s, Clint Eastwood found his next defining image. Harry Callahan. Dirty Harry. If the man with no name was a myth of the frontier, Dirty Harry was a myth of the modern city. The desert became San Francisco. The outlaw became the criminal. The gunfighter became the cop. And America, shaken by crime, unrest, political distrust, and the aftershocks of the 1960s, was ready for a character who did not wait politely for the system to work. Harry Callahan was not gentle. He was not diplomatic. He did not believe procedure should protect violent criminals from consequence. To some viewers, he was thrilling. To others, he was dangerous. That division is exactly why the character became unforgettable. Dirty Harry gave people a fantasy of justice without delay. A man who saw evil clearly. A man who acted. A man who did not hide behind committees, excuses, or bureaucracy. But the deeper problem was always there. If one man can decide justice by himself, where does justice end and power begin? That question made Dirty Harry controversial. It also made it important. Harry Callahan was not just a cop in a movie. He was a debate wearing a badge. And for Eastwood, that image would follow him for the rest of his career. The world had decided what kind of man he was. But Eastwood's later films suggest he was never fully comfortable with the simplicity of that decision. The audience thought they were watching a hero. Eastwood may have been watching something much darker. Because the role that made him powerful would later become the very myth he needed to destroy. While acting made him famous, directing gave him a second life. Eastwood did not approach directing like a young artist desperate to show off. He approached it like a craftsman. Arrive prepared. Trust the actors. Get the scene. Move on. His company, Malpaso, gave him control. His reputation for working quickly became famous. He did not waste time. He did not seem interested in making the set feel mystical. He treated filmmaking as work, discipline, and instinct. That method gave many of his films a directness that some critics found too plain. But over time, that plainness became part of his signature. Eastwood was not interested in decoration for its own sake. He preferred simple lines, quiet rooms, moral problems, weathered faces, and endings that leave something heavy behind. His films often do not shout. They wait. They allow emotion to gather slowly. Then, near the end, something breaks open. This is one of the reasons Eastwood became a different kind of master late in life. He did not chase youth. He did not try to imitate younger directors. He became more himself. The great turning point came in 1992. Unforgiven. By then, Eastwood was already in his 60s. He could have made another comfortable Western. He could have returned to the familiar image of the fast gun and the righteous avenger. Instead, he made a film that felt like an answer to every Western he had ever made. Unforgiven is not about how exciting violence is. It is about what violence costs. Eastwood plays William Money, a former killer who has tried to bury his past. He is older now. Poor. Widowed. Awkward. Far from the effortless gunfighter the audience might expect. He is not a legend riding proudly across the horizon. He is a man struggling in the mud. That image alone changed everything. The Eastwood myth had aged. And age had stripped away the glamour. In Unforgiven, killing is not clean. It is not heroic. It is clumsy, frightening, painful, and morally corrosive. Men who talk about killing discover they are not ready for what it means. Men who claim to represent order are capable of cruelty. Men who once built reputations on violence are haunted by it. Then came the most important part. Eastwood, the most famous Western figure of his generation, stood at the center of it all, dismantling the romance of the genre that made him. That is why Unforgiven felt like more than a movie. It felt like a reckoning. The cowboy had returned to tell the truth about the cowboy. The film did something most stars never dared to do. It took the genre that made Eastwood immortal and removed the romance from it. It took the gunfighter and made him old. It took revenge and made it ugly. It took killing and made it slow, awkward, frightening, and spiritually poisonous. In the old Westerns, a man pulled a gun and became a legend. In Unforgiven, a man pulls a gun and becomes haunted. That is why the film feels almost like a confession. Eastwood was not simply making another Western. He was holding a mirror up to every myth he had helped create. The silent cowboy. The righteous killer. The man who solves the world with a bullet. Unforgiven asks, what happens after the audience stops cheering? What happens when the dead remain dead? What happens when the killer has to live long enough to remember? This was not Eastwood abandoning his legend. It was Eastwood putting his legend on trial. After Unforgiven, his films became increasingly concerned with fate, family, memory, and moral damage. A Perfect World, released in 1993, is one of his most quietly devastating works. On the surface, it is a story about an escaped prisoner and a young boy. But underneath, it is about fatherhood, childhood wounds, the failure of institutions, and the strange tenderness that can exist in people the law calls criminals. Eastwood does not ask the audience to excuse wrongdoing. He asks something harder. Can a person be guilty and still human? That question runs through much of his later work. The Bridges of Madison County showed another side of him. A quiet, romantic, restrained film about love, duty, memory, and the choice not taken. For viewers who only knew Eastwood as the gunman or the cop, the film revealed a surprising tenderness. He was not only interested in men who carry weapons. He was interested in people who carry regret. That regret became one of the great themes of his late career. In Mystic River, childhood trauma becomes an adult tragedy. In Million Dollar Baby, ambition becomes love, and love becomes an impossible moral burden. In Flags of Our Fathers and Letters from Iwo Jima, war is not treated as a simple monument, but as a human disaster seen from opposing sides. In Gran Torino, the old racist veteran becomes something more complicated, a man trapped in bitterness, facing a changing world, and finally choosing sacrifice over violence. Eastwood's late films often ask the same question in different forms. What does a person owe after a lifetime of mistakes? Can one final act redeem a life? Is justice the same as punishment? Can violence ever end violence? These questions matter because they come from a man whose own screen image was built on the fantasy of decisive action. The younger Eastwood pulled the trigger. The older Eastwood asked what remained afterward. Gran Torino may be the clearest example. Walt Kowalski is old, angry, isolated, and stuck in the past. He is not a comfortable character. He is not softened for easy approval. But Eastwood slowly reveals the loneliness beneath the anger. Walt does not simply hate the modern world. He fears being useless in it. He fears becoming unnecessary. That fear connects deeply to Eastwood's own screen persona. What happens to the tough man when toughness is no longer enough? What happens to the old hero when the world no longer needs his kind of heroism? The answer in Gran Torino is not more gunfire. It is sacrifice. The man who once built his legend through force chooses a different ending. That choice feels like Eastwood speaking to his own myth again. The old way cannot save the future. Something else is required. Then came The Mule. In that film, Eastwood plays an elderly man who has neglected his family and spent his life chasing work, attention, and independence. The plot involves crime, but the heart of the movie is not crime. It is regret. An old man realizes too late that the applause of the outside world cannot replace the people he failed to love properly. It is hard not to read The Mule as personal. Eastwood has lived a long public life. He has been admired, criticized, desired, feared, celebrated, and questioned. He has also been known for a complicated personal life with relationships, children, distance, and reconciliation. The Mule feels like an old man looking back and asking what success really cost. Not in a dramatic speech, not in a confession, but in the quiet way Eastwood prefers. A look, a pause, a silence at the dinner table. Cry Macho continued that late reflection. It was not the loud return of a young cowboy. It was slower, thinner, gentler. Here was Eastwood, in his 90s, returning once more to the Western road, not to prove that he was still young, but to show what remains when youth is gone. The body is slower. The voice is thinner. The myth has softened. But the journey continues. And then came juror number 2. At more than 90 years old, Eastwood directed a legal thriller about a man trapped inside a moral dilemma. That choice is revealing. After all the westerns, all the cops, all the soldiers, all the fighters, Eastwood's late concern is not action. It is conscience. A man sits in judgment of another man, only to realize that he may not be innocent himself. That is pure late Eastwood. Justice is never simple. Institutions are never enough. A person must eventually face what he knows inside. Juror number 2 feels like the work of a filmmaker still asking the same question that has haunted his career for decades. What is justice when everyone is compromised? That question makes sense coming from Clint Eastwood, because his career has been a long journey from certainty to doubt. The young Eastwood embodied certainty. The old Eastwood directed doubt. And maybe that is why his final years feel so important. He is not simply an old celebrity still working. He is one of the last living bridges to a Hollywood that no longer exists. He worked in television when westerns ruled the living room. He became a movie star when international cinema and American genre films collided. He survived the new Hollywood era. He became a director when stars were learning to take creative control. He won Oscars when many assumed his best years were behind him. He kept making films when most of his contemporaries were gone. He became, in a strange way, a monument. But Eastwood has never seemed comfortable as a monument. He has always preferred motion. A new film. A new schedule. A new set. A new moral problem. There was a famous idea around him that he would rather keep working than talk about legacy. That feels very Eastwood. For some artists, legacy is something to polish. For Eastwood, legacy seems to be something you outrun by starting the next project. But no one can outrun time forever. That is the shadow over this final chapter. Clint Eastwood lived long enough to see Hollywood become almost unrecognizable. The westerns faded. The old studio system disappeared. The masculine heroes of the past became complicated, criticized, sometimes even rejected. The kind of man Eastwood once played, silent, armed, certain, no longer fit the world as easily as he once did. But Eastwood did not vanish with that world. He adapted in the strangest way. He did not become modern by pretending to be young. He became modern by questioning the old myths from inside them. That is why his late career matters. He is not an outsider attacking the legend of the American tough guy. He is the legend himself, turning around in old age and asking whether the legend was ever as noble as people believed. The older Eastwood became, the quieter his films seemed to get. But quiet did not mean empty. It meant the noise had burned away. By the time he reached his 80s and 90s, Eastwood was no longer chasing the energy of youth. He was filming old men, broken families, public judgment, private guilt, and the strange weight of living too long with your own mistakes. That is what makes his final chapter so haunting. Most Hollywood legends spend their last years being celebrated for who they used to be. Eastwood kept working as if he was still trying to understand who he had been. The cowboy, the cop, the killer, the father, the stranger, the old man, the director. It is almost as if every late film is another room in the same house, and Eastwood is walking through that house slowly, opening doors he once kept closed. The badge, the gun belt, the director's chair, the empty road, the courtroom, the porch, the desert, the family table, the grave, the movie set. Each one holds a piece of the myth. Each one asks what the myth cost. This is why Clint Eastwood remains different from many stars of his generation. A star built only on beauty fears time. A star built only on youth disappears when youth disappears. But Eastwood was built on silence, danger, and endurance. Age did not destroy that image. Age transformed it. The lines in his face became part of the story. The thinner voice became more haunting. The slower movement made the old roles feel less like entertainment and more like memory. When he was young, silence made him mysterious. When he was middle-aged, silence made him powerful. Now, silence makes him elegiac. It feels like the silence of someone who has seen too much to explain it all. That is why a video about Eastwood can not only be a list of films. His life is not just a filmography. It is a transformation of American masculinity on screen. In the beginning, he was the man with no name. Then he was the man with a badge. Then he was the man with a past. Then he was the man with regrets. Finally, he became the old man still standing after the world that created him had disappeared. And that may be the secret of Clint Eastwood's power. He never fully belonged to comfort. Even when he became successful, he carried an outsider quality. He did not seem like a polished studio prince. He seemed like someone who had wandered in from a harder landscape. That quality allowed him to age differently from many stars. The roughness became history. The silence became memory. And his films followed that face into old age. Many filmmakers soften with age. Eastwood became simpler, but not always softer. His films could be tender, but they could also be severe. He believed in individual responsibility. He distrusted easy sentiment. He often focused on people who are judged too quickly by institutions, media, communities, or history. Sully. Richard Jewell. The Men of War films. The Boxer in Million Dollar Baby. The Old Veteran in Gran Torino. The Juror in Juror Number 2. Again and again, Eastwood returns to people caught between public judgment and private truth. That theme may explain why audiences over 40 still connect with him. Because age teaches something youth often does not understand. Life is rarely clean. Good people make terrible mistakes. Bad people may carry wounds. Institutions can protect, but they can also crush. Heroism can be real and still misunderstood. Family can be the deepest responsibility and the deepest regret. And time does not forgive simply because a person grows old. Eastwood's movies understand that. They are not always perfect. Some are uneven. Some are too plain. Some have been criticized for politics, simplicity, or sentiment. But even the weaker films often feel like the work of a man still wrestling with something real. That is rare. Especially in an industry that often hides age, Eastwood turned age into subject matter. He did not pretend the old man was young. He placed the old man at the center and asked what remains. What remains after fame? What remains after violence? What remains after desire? What remains after family disappointment? What remains after the myths are gone? The answer in Eastwood's world is often work. Responsibility. Memory. Regret. And sometimes, one last chance to do the right thing. That is why his final chapter is not only sad. It is strangely inspiring. Not because he is immortal. No one is. Not because every film is a masterpiece. They are not. But because Clint Eastwood kept creating long after the world expected him to stop. At an age when many people are remembered only in past tense, he continued to place new moral questions on screen. There is something moving about that. The old cowboy did not ride off after one sunset. He kept riding through several. And now, when audiences look back at his life, they see not one career, but many. The television actor. The spaghetti western icon. The American action star. The director. The Oscar winner. The jazz lover. The mayor of Carmel. The old master. The man who built myths. The man who challenged them. The man who made violence look cool. The man who later showed violence as a wound. The man who seemed to say very little, yet spent more than half a century making films that ask heavy questions. What does it mean to be guilty? What does it mean to be brave? What does it mean to protect someone? What does it mean to be forgiven? What does it mean to grow old in a world that remembers only who you used to be? Maybe Clint Eastwood's greatest achievement is not that he became a legend. It is that he lived long enough to question the legend. The man with no name became a man with too much history. Dirty Harry became a director of moral uncertainty. The cowboy became the old master. And the old master kept returning, film after film, to the same haunted territory. Justice, regret, violence, family, death, mercy. The final years of Clint Eastwood are not about a dramatic fall. They are about endurance. A slow fade, not into weakness, but into reflection. His late work feels like a man walking through the rooms of his own past, touching each object one last time. And perhaps that is why the title fits, even while he is still living. The life and last days of Clint Eastwood is not about declaring an ending. It is about watching the last chapter of a rare American artist who has already outlived almost every category placed upon him. He outlived the Western. He outlived the tough guy era. He outlived the studio system that first shaped him. He outlived the critics who underestimated him. He outlived the idea that actors cannot become serious directors. He outlived the idea that old men must disappear quietly. And in doing so, he became something Hollywood almost never produces anymore. A living old master. Not polished. Not fashionable. Not easy. But seasoned by time. Seasoned by failure. Seasoned by criticism. Seasoned by work. Seasoned by silence. Seasoned by all the ghosts that gather around a man who has spent his whole life turning violence, guilt, and memory into cinema. In the end, Clint Eastwood's greatest role may not be the man with no name. It may not be Dirty Harry. It may not even be the old director behind the camera. His greatest role may be the man who lived long enough to become a witness against his own myth. He showed audiences the thrill of the gun. Then he showed them the cost. He showed them the fantasy of justice. Then he showed them the burden of judgment. He showed them the power of silence. Then he filled that silence with regret. That is why Clint Eastwood is not only a Hollywood survivor, he is a Hollywood reckoning. A man who became famous as an answer and grew old as a question. What is courage after the violence ends? What is justice after the law fails? What is manhood after the myth collapses? What is left of a legend when time finally makes him human? Clint Eastwood has spent more than 70 years on screen and behind the camera, but his final chapter may be the most revealing one. Because the old cowboy did not simply ride into the sunset. He stopped. He looked back. And he asked what the sunset had cost. Hollywood has changed. The old Western towns are gone. The studio backlots are quieter. The heroes are different now. The audience is different. The world is different. But somewhere in the long memory of cinema, Clint Eastwood is still standing alone against a fading sky. Not as the young stranger who entered town with no name. Not as the angry cop demanding justice. But as the old filmmaker who has seen the whole story from both sides. The myth. And the cost of the myth. That is why Clint Eastwood remains one of the last figures of his kind. A star who became a master. A master who became a witness. And a witness who kept filming until the final light began to fade. For more than 70 years, he has carried the American screen through deserts, cities, battlefields, boxing rings, bridges, courtrooms, family homes, and lonely roads. And when the curtain finally comes down on the Clint Eastwood story, it will not close on just one man. It will close on an entire idea of Hollywood. A Hollywood of weathered faces. Simple stories. Hard choices. Quiet pain. And men who said less because the silence carried more. Clint Eastwood is Hollywood's most seasoned master. And his final chapter is not just about age. It is about what remains after a legend has lived long enough to become human.